Well, hello, everyone. My name's Philip Goad, and you can see Theo Blankley just go out of the Japanese room there. I'm in the Japanese room here at the Melbourne School of Design at the University of Melbourne. But first, I'd like to begin this afternoon's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respect to their elders and families, past and present. So welcome to today's panel discussion, hosted by ACAHUCH, the Australian Centre of Architectural History, Urban and Cultural Heritage here at the University of Melbourne. Based within the Melbourne School of Design, ACAHUCH is a research centre established to promote and undertake high-quality, collaborative and interdisciplinary research in design, application, theory, history, politics and cultural significance of architectural, urban and cultural heritage. ACAHUCH facilitates, fosters and invites industry partnerships and collaborations, and it serves to provide professional pathways for graduates of the Masters of Urban and Cultural Heritage program delivered by the Melbourne School of Design. Now, joining us today, we have Pamela McGirr, Jury Chair for the 2023 AIA Heritage Architecture Panel, along with jurors Mark Raggatt of ARM and Christine Phillips of RMIT University. Our panellists today include James Wilson, a Director of Lions, Nathan Bishop, Design Principal in charge of Koenig Eisenberg, and Nathan's coming to us from Los Angeles, so we're very pleased to have you, Nathan.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Nigel Bertram and Marika Nostroupny, Founding Directors of NMBW, Mark Stevenson, Heritage Practice Director at Trethowan, Dan Blake, Co-Founder and Conservation Architect at Conservation Studio, and Julian Kozloff and Stephanie Bullock, co-founders and directors of Kozloff. And all will be discussing their winning or nominated projects in this year's awards ceremony. So to kick off proceedings, I'm going to ask Pamela McGirr, Mark Raggatt and Christine Phillips to discuss the jury process. So Pamela, over to you.
Thanks, Philip, and thanks for the invitation. It's good to be here. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners. The ways of the Aboriginal people are a huge part of the environmental heritage in this country, and it's important that we acknowledge this in a setting such as this one. I'll be voting yes, and I hope you're all with me. And just a note that in addition to Christine, Mark and myself, architect Harrison Smart was a non-voting jury member. The Heritage Awards have two categories: conservation, which celebrates how traditional styles, habits and building methods might remain a positive presence in our towns and landscapes, and creative adaptation, which celebrates new uses that preserve a strong sense of cultural legacy through built form. All entries to the awards have inherent architectural and heritage challenges, and to rank the challenge is the privileged and careful job of the jury. A quick summary of the numbers this year: 17 projects were submitted in total. 2 of these were submitted in both categories, so there were 19 considerations for us overall. To break down each category, for creative adaptation, we had 12 projects. 6 or 50% of the entries were shortlisted. 2 received an award or commendation. For conservation, there were 7 projects, but 6 were shortlisted, a high strike rate of 85%. 5 or 70% received an award or a commendation. One of these conservation entries, the Queen Victoria Market Sheds, received the highest award, the best in show across both categories. We thought their challenges were immense and highly creative, and they were fierce contenders for the AIA Vic Medal this year. The numbers tell us that the conservation category was highly successful this year. In this category, we observe many challenges to high quality outcomes, and I think this sometimes comes from clients having conservation requirements foisted upon them. But it seemed this year the clients were eager collaborators seeing benefit. So we wish to highlight this good news. I'll finish quickly with a note that heritage work is not for impatient people. It's full of lengthy investigation, consultation, and permit processes. It's actually noisy work with opinionated and passionate stakeholders. And I hope we hear about some of this in the presentations. So congratulations to all the architects who survived to enter these awards. And I'll pass over to Mark and Christine for some more comments on our process. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela.
What do you think, Christine?
Christine.
Okay. Thanks, Pamela, and thank you for the invitation. Yes, I will also be voting yes. It was such a terrific year, very strong entries all around, and it was the first time I was on the jury, and just wanted to note we had some very lively debates and conversations throughout the process. I think one of the challenges I found was in the two subcategories, but only having one named award. And so there was a lot of discussion around that because there was enormously diverse entries. And also to note the inclusion of Indigenous histories came up with the Melbourne University Student Precinct project, which I think also brought about conversations in relation to post-settlement histories and the inclusion of Indigenous heritage in history throughout the process as well. And I'll hand it over to you, Mark.
Well, there's 3 of us voting yes at least, so that's a good start. I mean, I think it's such a entangled category. There are so many kind of overlapping themes, and in the end, I think it comes down to this kind of extraordinary kind of love of architecture. There's this sort of great passion in the people who work in this category, not least the clients. I think Pamela's right. It's right and proper, I think, to include the clients in how we discuss it. I think I really appreciated the conversations that we had as a group, because it covered through the kind of cultural and historical implications of architecture over time, and then equally a very intense technical discussion around how we interact with and how we particularly conserve and preserve architectural fabric. And I think one of the kind of consistent comments from the architectural teams was that, particularly in the conservation category, that maybe the rest of the industry doesn't understand what they do very well. And so I think the more that we can do to promote understanding of that work, and I think particularly students who are deeply interested in the tectonics of architecture would do well to look at what heritage architects and conservation architects are working on. It's an incredibly fascinating area and filled with boffins, and who doesn't love a boffin?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I'd like now to hand over to James Wilson from Lyons and Nathan Bishop from Koning Eisenberg to present the new student precinct strategy at University of Melbourne.
Thanks, Philip. And I'll add my number 4 yay to the voice as well. And I hope everyone's going to continue to tally throughout this presentation as well. So yeah, Nathan and I are going to just spend a few minutes setting up, I guess, the precinct strategies. A lot to do with adaptation and heritage of a different time. And then I think Nigel and Marika will follow through with probably more I wouldn't say straightforward, but more historical heritage, if you like. So the Student Precinct Project at the University of Melbourne is a large $230 million project that was done over the last 6 years. It was indebted greatly to the knowledge of the local people, the Woiwurrung people, especially our collaborating Indigenous architect, Chief Greenaway. But obviously we want to pay respects to all of the local Indigenous elders, past, present, emerging, as well as the ones that inputted to the project right across the country. The project is in the kind of a corner of what would be considered, I guess, the older reaches of the university, the sort of the big sort of quadrangle here. It's on the corner of Grattan Street and Swanson Street. And I think the story from the university is that it was moved there because that's the new epicentre of the university. I think it was also the student centre was moved there because it was an available area of the university that needed redevelopment. But it hits 2 marks. It sort of makes the student precinct in an area of the university that now has outreach to Swanson Street and to the city. And as you can see in this image, it's quite a large number of buildings that are integrated into this precinct. But as you can see, it connects straight to that spine into the city, but it also connects into the depths of all the heritage and the campus of Melbourne University itself. It had a large collaboration team. So it had, obviously on screen with us today is Koning Eisenberg, along with Lyons, NMEW. We also had Architects Eat, Greenaway Architects, along with 2 landscape architect firms, Aspect Studios and Glass. And everyone had a different part to play, dealing with different types of the brief, which is partly to do with adaptive heritage and reuse, partly to do with new build and partly to do with urban design and landscape, and a lot to do with Indigenous knowledge coming into the whole precinct. I won't go into too much what was in each of the buildings. Suffice to say, it was a complex array of a lot of things, all to do with student support and student culture. Anything from performing arts through to events and gathering, through to chill out zones, through to postgraduate studies, and importantly, a bit that's still to come, an Indigenous Support Centre, Murray. So really, it's a whole precinct revolved around student needs. So it has no business case. It's not a faculty trying to get research money. It's all about students and about their experience. The heritage of the site is really interesting. It's got a very steep slope from one corner of the other, about 8 metres. And generally, the sort of old contours of the site have been changed and altered, of course, with the built environment that's been brought into the site. So a lot of the history that we looked at in terms of pre-building history was to do with the remnant creeks and remnant waterways that came through the site, and seeing if we couldn't introduce more of the Indigenous terrain that was there before the buildings themselves. But one of the biggest things we had to contend with was this raised plaza. If any of you know this precinct before the new precinct was built, it had a big sort of 60s, 70s raised plaza that connected to these buildings to the right, the old Doug McDonald and the Eastern Resource Centre, under which stood lecture theatres, plant spaces, substations and so forth. But it really restricted a lot of the, I guess, development around the site and the access through the site as well. So one of the earliest things that was done to the site, and this was actually done under a master plan early works by JCB Architects, was to remove this urban plaza, which is sort of noted by the red line. And so what this did for us was, one, it sort of brought it down to natural ground, which is a great starter for Indigenous cultural sort of adaptation. But 2, it actually, and this will be talked about later with Nigel and McGirr, it uncovered a whole new ground interface which wasn't there before and had to be completely readapted, I guess, from scratch. And, you know, effectively, we've got this new precinct now, which, you know, when you've integrated all those ground floor and new active components, is a complete transformation of the site. So what's in it? In blue, we had 2 new buildings, an arts and cultural building and a student pavilion to the north by Lyons and AIA. Then we have some purple buildings, which are creative readaptation or refurbishment of building 168 and the Eastern Resource Centre. And then what you call proper heritage upgrades of building 189, which used to be called Frank Tate, and the 1888 building, which is obviously a really fantastic building to Grattan Street. And in the future will be Maribyrnong in 2026. The whole precinct was considered as landscape-led. So again, this was a sort of story about starting with Indigenous ground and landscape, going through and around buildings. So we literally did master plan it, thinking about the pedestrian urban connections and groundscape first. And then it had 3 new sort of important entry points. One from Swanston Street, so it's a new opening to the university through a gateway that's created by actually knocking down an old heritage building, the John Smythe. An entry from Monash Road through a very active retail precinct, and a new idea of an entry from the south of Grattan Street called the Welcome Ground. And this was an Indigenous terrain that was basically built into the project. We also wanted to connect with the heritage of the campus itself. It's not a precinct unto itself. It's connected to a much wider campus. So a lot of these laneways and access ways into the site were also brought within the precinct. But we also wanted the sort of serendipitous to be known as well. People sort of wandering through the site under these sort of strange sort of walkways through the site, connecting Melbourne Connect, a new part of the campus, the Carlton community and Grattan Street. Importantly, the work that GFA did in terms of really looking at cultural histories and Indigenous histories was to look at really what narratives and activations we could integrate into the precinct, into design. So part of the Elevate RAP that we were following, that the university had just instigated as part of the university's strategy, was to integrate physical properties and memory into the precinct. This is very different to, I guess, just acknowledging Indigenous cultures. It's actually doing something. And it went from the sort of mega stories of the water story, the River of No Sound that was taken away from this site, integrating it back into the terrain, and actually having a landscape story that integrated local stones from around Victoria. This is a really big idea. To really sort of smaller ideas, which is like this, embedding Indigenous identity bricks into heritage fabric that actually, embeds cultural memory into old fabric and old projects. I'll hand over to Nathan now and just tell me when to click, Nathan.
Oh, sure thing. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep, all good.
All right, thank you, James. Hi, everyone. I'm Nathan Bishop, partner in charge of design at Koenig Eisenberg and lead designer for the Student Pavilion. You want to go to the next one, James? You go to the next slide. There we go. You may be able to tell I am not Australian, so I speak today completely. Oh, go one back to the pavilion, James. Sorry. So I'm here today as an outsider and certainly not an expert in Australian history, but I want to zoom out for a minute and just talk about a certain thread that I see in the precinct and that I think is really about changes in ideas about university life and the changing role of the university in the life of the city, and about changing ideas about the lives of students while at school. Really, I see a shift for the university from a space of detachment or removal for the purposes of study and becoming, which is still a notion very present in American universities. I see it basically moving away from the idea of a cloister and with having buildings and spaces that disconnect and detach from the ground and context to more of a place of connection, of fostering community, creating transparency, interconnectedness, visibility, and inclusiveness. So this is kind of a certain inversion or turning inside out of this old cloister model to one of more engagement and encounter that I think is present across the precinct. So the student pavilion that you see here on Monash makes an effort to feel embedded into the land with nooks and crannies carved into the sidewalk, trying to create spaces of encounter and foster a new kind of attachment and engagement and entanglement with public space. Go to the next one, James.
Is there a delay there, Nathan, when I'm clicking?
Yeah, there must be a delay. I'll just keep talking because I know Philip's going to cut me off. This it really continues down Monash with arts and culture, where the sidewalk levels spaces of engagement turn what used to be a former edge. You might remember, I'm not sure the audience, but Alice Hoy, the building where the student pavilion was lifted off the ground, had a pit kind of around it to the sidewalk. And so all of these buildings in the precinct are really trying, instead of lifting off and away, they're trying to, and trying to create boundaries and edges. Ours are trying to work to entangle with the land and bring the land through, which I think you can see here with the student pavilion. The sidewalk brick is pulled through the level with open kind of pavilion architecture around and through the building, bringing the landscape of the precinct to the street. And this continuous, do you want ERC? Oh, thank you. All right. This kind of continuous ground strategy and creating social spaces along the pathways of movement, as James pointed out, are really trying to bring those landscape up through the building, around and throughout the precinct. All right, now the ERC. I mean, I think oh, that's a cool animation. I didn't see that in the original. I think the ERC kind of typifies this inversion that I'm talking about, where a formerly introverted building that's detached from a context is really turned inside out and transformed from a place of seclusion and detachment. If you go to the next slide, James, to a space of engagement and support for social dimensions that works to make more fuzzy edges and blurry boundaries, and creating more visibility and activity, and really present a new model for engagements between building and grounds and people at school. You go to the next one. So the strategy really pervades the precinct to make fewer and fewer discrete spaces and erasing more and more of the interiors of buildings to have a more continuous flow of public space originating in the landscape. Next slide. It's brought through places of vertical movement, interconnecting all levels with visible movement and activity, threading through all the spaces. Go to the next slide. So the student pavilion with its upper level balconies and patios, and trying to make them more visibly engaged with multiplied ideas about ground over the whole height of the building. Go to the next slide. So rooftop perches for study or having lunch with friends. Next slide. And interior spaces that strongly visually engage with the context and locate this place as a perch within the city. It's intentionally designed to position people together in this place. Next slide. And I think, as James had a slide of as well, well, we're also embedding throughout Indigenous stories and cultural objects in these spaces of movement and encounter. Next slide. So this pulls up and tries to be, this landscape and grounds up at the top of the buildings, create new layered grounds for different views of the city and engagement with the buildings and its surroundings. Go to the next slide. And lastly, we have this expressive stair and bridge linking arts and culture and the amphitheater, all pulled up through the building, creating more spaces that where you can see people moving, which is also a kind of inversion on buildings. So I think with the pavilion, really trying to add a kind of architecture to the university would support a form of casual social engagement and placing it within the precinct to foreground a new kind of idea space for students. And it's a model that I think stands in contrast or as an alternative to more conventional institutional kind of privileged notions of academic space and a more inclusive social space. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, James.
And I'll wrap it up in 1 minute for you, Philip, so you can keep on time. So The only thing we wanted to point about the Arts and Culture building, it's a new building, but we did a lot of work to embed cultural history in it. And again, this is about heritage. So it's about memory and continuing the student story from, what was there at the old Union House and what the performing arts represented to students, and embedding it both physically, but also in performance spaces within the building. So I guess a lot of the work we did was embedding the memory within the building, so heritage memory within new fabric, going back to even like the degenerations represented within the walls of the actual performing arts centre, the 400-seat proscenium arch centre in the building, carpets which are designed in collaboration with Indigenous artists, and I guess lots of these sort of stories about memory and waves and scrims and theatre coming into play. So we actually get a really physical interpretation of what culture means to the university. And again, I'll flick through these because I think we'll get onto the actual part of the memory of the actual heritage parts that Nigel will take over. But the major part I'll finish off on was the amphitheatre. The amphitheatre is a very new part of the university. It's a big part of the Indigenous story about connecting, yarning, landscape, bringing everyone together within the centre of the precinct. And of course, it's amplified by this beautiful restored Frank Tate building, which I'll hand over to Nigel and Marika to talk about.
Great, thanks, James. Thanks, Nathan. So, Nigel and Marika.
Oh, I can't hear you, Nigel.
Nigel, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Hi, Marika.
Hi. Nigel, it feels like you're talking.
Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry.
Now we can.
Sorry about that. It's just too many screens open. Okay, I'm going to move straight on and just say that part of the process of unpacking this previous teachers' college, we actually had to reconstruct physically the layers of what happened and some curious things like the old Frank Tate building was originally just an appendage to the 1888 building and literally linked by raised bridges. And the current apse, if you like, facing the amphitheatre was the back of the building, like a fire escape, embedded into the ground in a kind of retaining wall. And then in the 60s, when this raised plaza and the late modern buildings got built, of course, as James said, everything changed. So we were very interested in these sort of strange moments of different ideas sort of overlapping and bashing onto each other, and started to try to literally draw that out to understand the problem that we were faced with. at this great moment when the demolition had been done in the photos that James showed, it was like a quite exciting thing to find the old fabric of the building that was previously covered in plasterboard and reveal the sort of, you can see it's in pretty bad condition. The concrete's been hacked off and the windows have been blocked in. And this is how we found this kind of archaeological ruin almost of the building that's been embedded in the ground. So our process for design was to try to just be very careful and understand what was important and what was not. I mean, the outside of this building was heritage listed, but the inside was not. But we thought the whole brick interior meant that we had to treat the whole thing with great care and respect. So this is the demolition plan of sort of non-original bits. And this is the kind of repair plan, which is actually conservation works to bring that very degraded building back to some sort of form of wholeness. At the same time, the original building was quite odd and it was completely disconnected from its context. The main gymnasium up here was flanked by toilets and change rooms, and the whole thing was rigidly symmetrical, following on the segregation of the sexes from the 1940s ideology of the Teachers' College. So we thought that to put that into the contemporary university framework that Nathan was talking about, some actual quite dramatic or even violent change was required. So we thought we'd have a go at sort of cutting a few holes, and it's a load-bearing foreskin brickwork construction. So we became very interested in these needle and prop techniques that then opened up a sort of logical series of openings that both completely transformed, but also respected the structural sort of imprint or the partie of the building. So that the old gymnasium, which was a completely isolated chamber, is now a sort of free-flowing space that extends vertically and horizontally, and the students can literally flow through it. So you might think of it as democratizing the space that we found to bring it into a new era of a new role of a university campus in society and in the city. When we had to intervene, we felt under great pressure to sort of do something that was both new and also understanding of the original Percy Everett design ethos. And he has embedded this Indigenous artwork that James mentioned, but this was very important, another new insertion. And the fact that it's structural and actually holding the building up was really important. So the doors kind of allow a whole lot of different uses of this building that was previously sort of like a tomb and now is able to be activated and have bands and sausage sizzles and ping pong tournaments and all sorts of things. And this horizontal connectivity through the new doors with the raised floor, bring it up to the new welcome ground paving so that student life can just flow through it.
So we'll switch to talking about 1888, which is that E-shaped building. Yep, just on the left next to Frank Tate in the middle. Sorry, 168, say. And the courtyard is just what I wanted to point out here, that the courtyard is suddenly linking 1888 through all the way to the rest of the precinct, whereas previously it was really separated off. And we'll show you a few slides of how now from the courtyard we can look up all the way to the 168 that Nigel was just talking about, Frank Tate, the ERC with the little animation on the left, and all the way through to arts and culture and so on, and up to Monash Road. Yes, next. So the plan of the 1888 building, just quickly, there were four main, I guess, insertions that we made. So two of them are quite surface. Just on them in the middle at the top is a sort of circular window. Sorry, right up. Yeah, that's a surface really. And then there was some glazed bricks on the corner on the left there, which is the western wing. Yes. And then that just under there is that sort of noticeable gap cutting into the building, which we'll show you in a minute, which links to the courtyard. And then down the bottom is the old lift that was there, and then the new location of the lift. So this was a really crucial aspect of the project, and I'll just show you a few more slides about that. So for those who remember, there was actually a building inserted in this particular courtyard that we're talking about, and it included a lift, which obviously is about accessibility. Not that you could get there, because to get there in the first place, you had to go down these huge stairs, which is this whole precinct idea that James and everyone's been talking about. So get rid of those stairs, and this is partway through demolition, and you can still see the lift there, which is the one remaining portion for a while after that building was demolished. But you can see it totally obliterates the heritage interaction with the rest of the precinct. So here, there's a couple of plans, just to show you that the new lift is in this location, which actually means it can also open into the Griffin Gallery, which is at a sort of a mid-level, and the old lift couldn't do that. This also means it can interact with all the levels, including this main level, upper level, and even the top level of all. So all these were not able to be accessed with the previous external lift. So here's the new version of that courtyard, and there's no lift, blocking the way of what you can see. We're seeing the full heritage facades and really focusing on those aspects. On the right, you can see with those two windows as well, that it was this portion that was really degraded out of the 1888 building, and this is where we could have the most effect and impact in terms of really doing something to bring it in with the rest of the precinct. Yes, thank you. So internally, there was minimal work, but it was about retaining and allowing the existing condition to be recognised, and including, for example, pulling the furniture away from the windows so that you could actually get near the windows and experience the beautiful work that's there. This is the Griffin Gallery, which was previously inaccessible, and now it can be part of all the accessible aspects of the whole precinct. And as Nigel mentioned as well, we did feel quite a lot of responsibility to try and think through details that would act both as respectful to the heritage condition, but also really break open something new. So here's the insert with the veranda, which links with the gutter detail straight towards the courtyard, water story, which James was mentioning, is linking all the way through into the details of the courtyard. People walking through in various directions and experiencing the new glazed bricks, the new circular window, relationships to ERC and the Frank Tate building, and yes, and an actual experience of the old stairway that's been removed. So this is all part of our discussion of trying to actually make prominent and visible the layers of history, rather than just deleting them or covering them up in one way or the other. So suddenly all our portions of the project become part of the whole precinct. So there's a sense of continuity and change at the same time. So there's restoration and within a new setting and experience, the revealing history and the new use and activity, which, for example, Nathan was talking about, really makes it possible to experience and understand the kind of layers of history that are there. Thanks.
Perfect, perfectly timed. I was about to bring down the axe, so that's great. Thanks, Nigel and Marika. What we're going to do is keep rolling through, and then we'll get to a discussion at the end of all the presentations. But thanks very much. And our next presenter is Mark Stevenson from Trethowan. So Mark's talking to us about the Queen Victoria Market Shed restoration.
Oh, thank you, Philip. It's good to be here. Thank you for the invitation and to give us the opportunity to discuss our project. So, look, I'll get going with the screen share. So, wish me luck. We will try and get it going. So far, so good.
That's all perfect.
Excellent. There we go. Let's kill that one as well. Okay. Now we oh, sorry, something else just popped up. Bear with me. Cool. Look, I'd like to just begin my sort of presentation just by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. This Queen Victoria Market side, obviously with the cemetery there with the Aboriginal interments, is a very important site for the traditional owners. And the sort of the works that we did actually have a link and consideration to that important part of the heritage of the site, and is also kind of continuing with all the other refurbishment works which are happening on the site. It's a very busy part of the city at the moment. So we were very fortunate to be part of the team that facilitated the project. We worked very closely with ACAHUCH, which was obviously a project partner for us, but it was really a collaboration between the client, our structural engineer, building surveyor, the archaeologist, and of course the contractor as well, who played a very important part of the project. So just touching quickly on the history of the site. The site itself, the site in which the market stands, was set aside in 1837 as a cemetery. This was set aside by Richard Burke, of the Governor of New South Wales at the time. In 1859, the town council, Melbourne Town Council, then granted the east side of the cemetery as an extension and to establish a town market. And this then was further extended again to create the market site. And our sheds, which are depicted here as A, B, C and D, were constructed about 1877. And the Queen Victoria Market, it was officially called, then opened in 1878. Sheds H and I then followed on from that, and then over the years, you can see sort of from this image here, this is sort of taken from the 1930s, you can start to see just how big the market then became. But our works, and just obviously the collection of buildings, it's on the national list as well as the state list, Heritage Victoria's list, and also the local listing, just to recognise that sort of post-European heritage. But as I said, there is that kind of traditional layer there as well, which is not sort of really kind of seen through the sheds, but our project really focused on the buildings and the restorations of the buildings. So just with the brief, itself. So the brief was very much a brief that we worked in conjunction with the City of Melbourne on, and it involved the complete overhaul of sheds A to D, sorry, and H and I, and it involved all the structure services, and we looked at the improved trader facilities as well. And it was really to ensure the market continued to operate and have the ability to offer a greater variety of programs, as well as a more diverse beverage market offering. So we, as part of the program, so as part of that brief, it was important for the City of Melbourne and the market itself to make sure the works took place in situ. And this is sort of really where a lot of the challenges lied, in trying to allow the works to continue and allowing it to have minimal disruption to the traders and also with the market itself. And it was really important for the project as well to allow changes which didn't adversely impact the heritage fabric of the sheds. The part of the brief as well was also to have consultation with the stakeholders and the general public, and that was really important to the City of Melbourne to have that built into the brief itself. So with the process that we took with the building, with the project, was to establish a people's panel. NH Architecture and the City of Melbourne led on this, and this was basically a series of workshops that took place to allow the traders and the public to respond to the proposals that were being put forwards, and also to shape the brief directly. So there's a really important sort of link there. The workshops, specific workshops with the traders, also allowed them to talk through the service upgrades that were being proposed. This touched on things like waste disposal, and also on the design of the point of sale mobile food storage units, which were ultimately designed by NH Architecture. And these were important to ensure the traders' needs were met once the shed space was completed. Further consultation, extensive consultation occurred with Heritage Victoria, and that led then to the granting of the permit for the structural upgrades and the new roof works, and then a permit exemption was also applied for the conservation works themselves. So in terms of the process that we undertook as part of the projects, we did an extensive period investigation works. This basically identified multiple defects, missing and unsuitable situations, which needed then to be resolved. As we've got a sort of on the slide here, we've got the certain. This is just a small snapshot of some of the issues we were dealing with, but we had decay of the rotten column bases, which you can see here sort of sat within the stirrup. Water was getting in and decaying a bottom area here of the posts. We've also got sort of forming the middle one here. We've got a sort of series of damage where the column itself had been sort of probably hit, and also as well, it's obviously decay happening, rot happening to the timber work, probably getting in underneath the paint layer. And you've also got an evidence here of that kind of former repair process, which has gone on with the new joint being sort of scuffed in here into the existing post. This is probably has stemmed from an earlier issue here where the time they deemed it a way to approach this was to take out the old decayed section and put a new section in. So we were sort of very sort of mindful of those, and obviously sort of bringing in things like traditional techniques and things like that was kind of important to maintain the integrity of the sheds as well as the maintenance of original fabric, because when you're sort of dealing with posts, you know, sort of 140 so years old, they are, you know, it's very important to retain that fabric. And we've also have issues, sort of structural issues, in terms of where the corbels at the top of the posts were actually rotating due to the issues of the roof.
Now, Mark, you've gone 9 minutes.
Oh, 9 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So
Okay, cool.
speed up.
Yeah, no worries. So we basically, I'll just flick through the slides then. So we did a lot of understanding and testing. We did a lot of drawings where we were understanding what the issues were. A lot of input from the structural engineers in terms of dealing with a lot of these the issues. We then did a series of drawings where we were looking at what the decays were. So we did a lot of documentation where we were then able to sort of inform the builder of how to go about it. So sort of step-by-step drawings were produced. And these were some of the outcomes where, new timber posts were put in, new section joists were put in with this scarfing of the stirrups at the bottom there. Timber roof, new roof was put on. A lot of repair works were done to the trusses themselves. And really the outcomes is this, there's some new service bollards which service the traders. And this allowed all the redundant infrastructure to be removed. This is a point of sale information that NH Architecture worked closely with the traders on. And then really just to summarise the challenges we had, it was really important to preserve the tangible and intangible values of the sheds. They're a really important part of Melbourne's history. It was important to retain that historical patina, so we weren't just kind of taking things out because they looked scruffy and whatever. We wanted to keep those, we wanted to keep the fabric, and that sort of brought its challenges in trying to balance between modern building and commercial standards. So a lot of input from the structural engineer and the building surveyor to do this, but really it then enabled the site to to be viable and longevity as a continued and flexible market space. So there we go. Did I make the 10 minutes, Philip?
Thank you, Mark.
Cool. Thank you. Cheers. Thank you.
So our next presentation is from Dan Blake from Conservation Studio, who's going to be talking about the Fitzroy Town Hall ceiling conservation. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. So today I'm going to sort of talk through the repair of 24 ceilings at the Fitzroy Town Hall. And this is a little bit of a case study that looks at different methodologies of repair that respond to different types of issues that we found with a number of different compromised ceilings. Fitzroy Town Hall is included on the Victorian Heritage Register. It's of state significance for its architectural and historic values. It's considered to be a highly intact and rare example of a high Victorian building with its interior intact. Most metropolitan town halls underwent major upgrades during the 1920s and 30s, such that they don't contain intact Victorian interiors, whereas Fitzroy Town Hall is an example of one that does. It's a symbol of growth of Melbourne during the 1890s, during the boom period, the competition between sort of rivals, inner city suburbs to have the highest and best looking town halls, which come out of prominent architects such as Alice and George Johnson's work. And it's also the aspiration of a burgeoning wealth of Melbourne and this idea of spending money on government buildings that was an investment strategy for people with a lot of gold money at the time. Our process follows the Borough Charter, and it's an important principle within the Borough Charter to understand the significance of a place to be able to undertake works on it. You need to understand how that significance then becomes part of fabric, where the embodiment of that significance might exist within a building and how that might transpose itself into what you might be working on. The project, as I said, was the conservation stabilisation of 22 ceilings, using various stabilisation approaches, structural stabilisation of termite damage and rotten roof trusses that had compromised the original ceiling in the main hall, looking at hydraulic systems and looking at retrospective upgrades to those where they were causing impacts on other ceilings, and the restoration and conservation of decorative paint schemes, including paint sample analysis, which is an important part of understanding original schemes. A small chronology, just looking at the building and its development over a period of time. Fitzroy Town Hall was built in 3 main phases and underwent an enormous amount of change. We investigated the interior of the main hall and its decorative schemes, looking at different phases of change. The 1913 is the current inner setting of the actual hall, where the balcony was added in by William Pitt. That balcony still survives, and it changed the interior scheme that predated that, and it's now the current standing of what the hall looks like. Just locating the particular ceilings that we had dealt with throughout the building, giving you a sense. The main hall, of course, here. Council chamber is one that we will discuss, and the mayor's meeting room is one that we will discuss through this case study. Looking at various ways of consolidating ceilings, there are a number of different ways in which you can approach this particular issue. One method we looked at is where you use the pinning system. It's a mechanical based fixing system. We would tend to use that system where we're unable to access the floor cavity or the ceiling cavity, or where the removal of floors above would cause more detrimental impact than losing small amounts of plaster ceiling in order to come up with a mechanical fixing detail. Where cavities above ceiling spaces are able to be accessed, we would look at a resin system, which is a 2-part epoxy resin that is applied into 2 applications, which consolidates the ceiling and bonds what we call the lath keys, which are plaster keys that help hold the plaster to the lath system back to the original plaster. In the main hall, we had really deep profile moldings where we wouldn't get the saturation of that epoxy system, that resin system, into the depth of the molding. So we looked at the idea of using copper cable wire to actually tie off those deep profile moldings and ensure that they're re-adhered back to the ceiling structure above. You can see below the mayor's meeting room, which is a space that has a decorative ceiling that dates from the early 19-teens that was consolidated. This ceiling was repaired in the 1980s and had a lot of repair systems that had begun to fail and had begun to change. At the time, they had injected all of these cracks using a product called Paraloid B52, which was actually a cellulose nitrate-based system, and it discoloured with age, as the cellulose nitrate is not particularly stable. As a result, we looked at methodology of scraping out these cracks and then doing a minor fill. So we were doing things like trialling that on boards to see that we can do the most minimum amount of repair to that surface as necessary to remove the crack that is defective but not impact the broader painted ceiling system. Water damage, using a poultice-based system in order to remove salts and other efflorescents and to deal with some discoloration on the surface but without impacting on the paint itself. This is a paper pulp-based product. You see here the actual cracks refilled before repainting, again focusing on the most minimal amount of fabric removal necessary to repair and consolidate this ceiling. And you can see some of the discoloration that's occurring as a result of that paraloid over here that contained the cellulose nitrate as an unstable material. This is the former council chamber. In the 1930s, a new ceiling was put into the council chamber which concealed an earlier original paper hand-painted ceiling with stencil work. While doing works on the site in February, we had very, very heavy rain events that resulted in flash flooding of the roof above. And these internalised gutter systems that took the front gutter to the middle gutter and to the rear gutter were not coping with that. They were overflowing and flooding and causing damage to the 1930s ceiling. And as we then later found out, below that was the paper ceiling completely covered in mold and very, very, very badly damaged. As a part of this work, we investigated putting in a very contemporary and very modern hydraulic system, which is a closed system, a siphonic system, which we retrospectively added to the drainage system that now allows us to take all the water from the front and the back and to provide overflows to the roof that previously didn't have them. So this is using an adaptation of a very current and modern technology applied to a heritage building to solve a complex situation, and without altering the building in a major way. We're able to leave the original box gutters internalised in the roof there, side by side to the new system. The mould, obviously, is severely damaged. This was assessed heavily by conservators, and we reviewed this over a great long period of time and tried to dry out the room, tried to dehumidify the room. Unfortunately, it resulted in an enormous loss of paper at about 50% of the actual room itself, retaining smaller areas of the original paper here, which we were able to clean and then conserve by mechanically scraping back little bits of surface mould. The timberline substrate above, again, had mould on it. Again, this was brushed and sanded back in order to remove mould so that we could retain the original substrate. We then began working with a series of specialist trades in order to restore this ceiling and conserve the parts of it that still remained. And that included looking at very traditional installation techniques. So this paper ceiling is over a hessian lining that is like a scrim that's pulled tight over the timber lining boards. This is not a technique that is used very regularly anymore. It's a very rare technique of applying these sorts of finishes. So we worked extremely closely with a plasterer and a decorator and with conservators and trialled this in many, many different times in order to try and make sure that we get the tension in the hessian correctly, making sure that we get the right amount of glue without causing too much problem with the paper once it was lined, and went through the process of basically reinstating all the missing parts of the ceiling.
Now, Dan, you've gone 9 minutes, so... Okay,
great, thanks. So conservators worked very hard on this particular project, infilling using a pastel system in order to conserve. They used paper starch in order to fill and go through, and this is the end result. So you can clearly see here what is actually the original ceiling and what is a reinstatement. So it's a very honest approach towards the conservation of fabric that is original, still largely identifiable. The main hall space is a space where the ceiling had begun to collapse because the ends of these trusses had collapsed in the wall due to termite damage. Basically, we came up with a structural detail that had to be installed in situ without propping the ceiling. So everything in that particular structural design had to be manhandleable, had to be able to be carried up there, and had to be installed in situ using this temporary bracket underneath here. So this was designed in consultation with our structural engineers. We then went through a process of Westox treating the ceiling, which is that 2-part epoxy resin to bond it all back together again, and then began doing a stitching pattern to all these deeper mouldings, these very deep profile mouldings. You can see the wave in that ceiling as it is, as the ceiling had begun to collapse. We also went through paint sample analysis to determine the original scheme and investigated the entire scheme of the ceiling over several months. This is the documentation for that, where we documented all the original stencil design work, but unfortunately didn't have the budget to reinstate all of the stencil work, but restored all the correct colour scheme systems. And that's the before and after. So the one on the right is the after and the one on the left is the before from 1990. And the actual finished ceiling itself with the colours all restored to correct.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you very much. Perfect.
No problem.
Thank you. And our next presenter is Julian Kozlov and Stephanie Bullock from Kozlov. And they're talking about Warrnambool Library and Learning Centre.
Thank you. So, are we muted?
We can hear you.
Fantastic. So,
Smooth.
smooth as anything. So just before we bring up our presentation, so just to introduce ourselves, my name is Stephanie Bullock. I'm the Director of Kozloff Architecture, and I will be voting yes.
I'm Julian Kozloff, also Director of Kozloff Architecture, also voting yes, of course.
Now, can I just check, has that come up? Can you see our slides?
We can see we can see no notes on the right. That's right. Now you're good.
Excellent. All right. So, in terms of this particular project, we would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the site on which the project stands. It's in Warrnambool, so the Goodjudmara people as well.
I suppose for us, this project grappled with two fundamental questions originally, and the first one was, can public architecture be a real agent for change within a regional community? And second, how might we breathe new life into a heritage context through a contemporary lens?
So the Warrnambool Library and Learning Centre is in Warrnambool, which is a beach town west of Melbourne, located on the Great Ocean Road. And the project was jointly funded by the Victorian Government, South West TAFE, and the Warrnambool City Council, and consequently had a very complex client governance structure.
It replaced the existing Warrnambool Library, which is shown in green on the slide you're looking at the moment, with a much larger space, which is in the heart of Warrnambool CBD. And our new library is located in the Southwest TAFE campus and provides, facilities, with purposes to provide facilities for both community and Southwest TAFE students and staff.
So there are 9 heritage listed buildings on the Southwest TAFE site, and 8 of these are considered to be of state significance. At the start of the project, we looked at a variety of potential sites and also buildings for adaptive reuse within the campus. And in the end, the optimum combinational location was determined to be to refurbish the largest existing heritage building on the site, which is the orderly room, which is shown in blue, and then to extend this or connect it to a new 3-storey contemporary structure. We worked very closely with heritage consultant Raggatt to understand the history of the site and the orderly room in particular. And through the research that Bryce did, it was determined that the building had been extended several times over the years. The first 3 stages were considered to be the ones of most heritage value, and all of these have been retained within the final design. The research that Bryce did also revealed that during the second extension to the building in 1875, the orderly room was extended east and a stage was added at the eastern end. And whilst this stage had been removed many years before we started on the project, this understanding of the original operation of the main hall contributed significantly to our understanding as how we might link the original building and the new 3-storey contemporary structure.
We had 2 really key site strategies that informed, the formal resolution of our design. The first on the left was connection through the building and campus, central campus straight up to the CBD, which was to the north. And the second was really maintaining a north-south connection through the campus with an internal laneway that separated the orderly room from our contemporary extension.
So you can see from this site plan that the project included significant external works to also develop pathways from the building to both adjacent streets and also other areas within the campus. And this also included navigating a very significant level change from the street and the northern part of the campus in particular. So the orderly room you can see here is on the western side, and the new contemporary addition is located to the east.
The orderly room and the contemporary extension, sort of knitted together with the insertion of a new grand stair. There's a glazed linkway between the two, and that draws light back into the centre of the building, but also provides a very clear distinction between the heritage element and our contemporary addition. The grand stair or bridge operates in a similarly performative manner as the original stage within this room. With landings that offer space enough for seating and performances, and the kind of return of the speaker's corner, if you like. This is the linkway, which is a ground floor, an urban connector. It also acts as a light well between the 2 entities, the heritage and our addition. But it's also a very clear visual link to the surrounding context, a lot of which is also a heritage condition.
So it's the ground floor plan. The ground floor houses the main entry to the library, just to the west. It also has a skills and job centre. It has an indoor-outdoor cafe and various parts of the collection, including the children's collection in particular. Then on the middle level, there's a sort of youth and games and digital media training zone, a whole range of meeting rooms, and also the non-fiction area of the library, which is in the contemporary section. And then finally, the top level contains the fiction collection, as well as more meeting spaces and a reading lounge with views out to the ocean.
So the building's always read against or through this heritage context, which is the campus. It acts as a foil for the adjacent heritage listed buildings, from which it's clearly different, but it has the same investment in detailing and articulation. The sandy precast panels of our contemporary edition reference the repainted Orderly building, which is seen in the foreground. The contemporary extensions lifted off the ground. I guess that's a gesture of generosity.
The Orderly room had been used for many, many different purposes since it was built, and most recently it was being used as teaching and learning spaces and also offices by South West TAFE. The exterior shell of the building was largely intact, but there'd been a number of very poor quality recent structures that had adhered to it, as well as some odd structures installed within it. And these were all removed, and then the exterior of the building was repainted in accordance with heritage recommendations. And I guess the end result is that the new front door to the library is now through the heritage building. And so the internal space that you enter when you come through the front door is now the largest public space in Warrnambool, except maybe for Bunnings. It's a true civic space. It was wonderful when we did the original consultation. We held it within this space, and there were quite a few people who had actually never been in there, even though they had lived in Warrnambool their whole life. The ceiling, as you can see, has been fully restored, but the walls were left in an as-found condition. Since it opened at the end of last year, there's been a very significant increase in library patronage, in book loans, but also in attendance on site by South West TAFE students, and the space is very heavily utilised by the whole community, including remote workers and freelancers. The interior ceilings in the new contemporary building intentionally reference both the Warrnambool CBD grid, which was established also by Robert Hoddle, as well as the gridded coffered ceiling within the Orderly room. And this intentionally extends an existing architectural relationship with the city and as well as the heritage building, and serves to bind the contemporary and heritage buildings together. The grid and the articulated ceiling manifest in the design through every level of the new building, with different types of articulation acting as a contemporary interpretation of that original very beautiful ceiling. Oops, gone too far. So the ceiling plane continues what we consider spatial dialogue with the awning walkways that are also found throughout Warrnambool as well. So ornamental pressed tin, corrugated metal and timber lines defeats to represent a local vernacular language that manifests beyond the Orderly room itself throughout the broader town.
So it's the ground floor with a scalloped ceiling, referencing the oversized cornice of the Orderly room. The middle level, which is a sort of folded white concertina surface, the colour and the linear nature visually linking it back to that Orderly room ceiling. And then finally the top floor with its continuous timber coffered ceiling, another contemporary manifestation of the Orderly room grid. Throughout the project, the ceiling is really the only true singular connective device of each level, and it's an unencumbered gesture that defines each of these interiors.
You've done 9 minutes.
Nearly there.
Great.
There was a decision earlier on that we made to utilise a rectilinear floor plate. It was partly a tight site, but it was also a budgetary constraint. And around this is a precast concrete facade that's been strategically peeled back to create, opportunities of occupation inside, as well as curate the views around that surrounding context. Its depth, creates a kind of diffused or soft light internally and defines each of these reading or reflection areas. There's a quality of light that's, that changes over the course of the day. It's really beautiful within these spaces. Creating moments of compression and enclosure that I suppose, are reminiscent of a domesticity.
So at dusk, those highly articulated ceilings glow and they're visible from all of the surrounding streets and pathways and within the campus. And we think the success of the project lies fundamentally in its generosity. It's provided the whole community with access to one of the most significant heritage precincts and buildings in Warrnambool, as well as revitalising and opening up the heart of the South West Hope campus. And there's been measurably positive community impact in terms of the things we mentioned before around book loans, services, community use, and also the student experience, just demonstrated by the uplift in student attendance. So I guess in summary, we think it demonstrates the ability for public architecture to deliver really meaningful change within a regional city through an architecture of generosity and a deep respect for context, heritage, and community.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stephanie and Julian. Perfectly timed. Well done. So we now have about 15 minutes remaining for a general panel discussion. I'm going to kick things off by asking James, Nathan, Nigel and Marika. The whole student precinct at the University of Melbourne, one could have described some of the buildings there as worthless or not fit for purpose these days. So that I'm thinking of Doug McDonald building and the ERC. There may have been a temptation on the part of the university to replace those buildings. What's your feeling on the retention plus the retention too of the Percy Everett Frank Tate building? How important do you think it was to actually reuse those buildings, or would the whole scheme have taken a different turn had you been given a clean slate?
I've got a couple of comments on that, and maybe someone else can pitch in. I mean, I think one of the things was there was a design competition around this, Philip, as you well know, and I think there are architects who entered that with that attitude of it could all just be a new thing and you didn't have to retain any fabric. It was definitely, I mean, we should remind everyone here that there were buildings taken away. The Alice Hoy building was taken away, the John Smythe building. So actually there was a lot of extraction. And I think we felt there was a real positive having retention of some of the heritage there that would stitch in with the rest of the university. So we think it was a real positive. I might point out there was a commercial advantage in some ways to the university in keeping the Doug McDonald, in that you probably wouldn't get away with building a tower like that in certain parts of the campus again. So I think there was a part of it that was, you know, retain good floor space where you can, as well as retain good heritage buildings. But maybe Nigel and Marika might be better placed to comment.
Yeah, I mean, I might just add to that, of course, even though they're not listed, we thought that the ERC building in particular was quite noteworthy and made some efforts to clarify the understanding of that by removing additions to it and let you see it in the round. And that, you know, the story of the late modern period of university campuses is really part of the history of universities. And when we all worked on the sort of Bates Smart buildings at RMIT down the road, you know, they're all reaching the end of their life, and there was a lot of discussion then about demolition. But I think including that part of the history, I mean, it's a bit political now with, to say, the Housing Commission towers that are all in the news. What's the sort of attitude to that, to the retention or the value of that fabric? It's not just the space, it's also a sort of cultural memory.
Yeah, look, I agree. I'm a great champion of those late modern buildings, so I thought it was very commendable that you actually used them and that they're incredibly robust in terms of change. Marika, sorry.
I was just going to add that there's a cost element to it, which is interactive with a sustainability question. So it's actually a really bigger picture kind of moment where heritage, cultural history, memory intersects with contemporary economy, and where sustainable material use starts to take more priority than it used to. And of course the cost, which is where I started. But, you know, the renovation of so-called ugly modernist buildings is like a big part of our contemporary future, I think.
Sure. I'm just going to pause because I know I can see really good questions flashing up on the screen, and then the screen I've got here in the Japanese room, they did disappear. So I'm just hoping that Theo is going to somehow emerge with a laptop so that I can answer some of those questions. I saw there was a question from Hannah Louie, question from Ted Bailey. I'll keep going in because I've got questions for everyone. I had a question for Mark about the Queen Victoria Market. And Mark, I just wanted to get a sense about the time it took for, you said that all of the restoration work of the sheds took place while the traders were still trading. How long did that process take? And I couldn't quite understand how you could replace an entire roof and yet have the market still happening beneath you.
Yeah, no, it's fair enough. Yeah, look, in terms of the permits and all that kind of consultation work sort of happened in around 2021. So there was a fair bit of time spent obviously dealing with all that. And then in terms of the kind of allowing the market to operate, there was a lot of kind of closing off areas and then moving market traders over and then bringing in opening up other areas. So there was a lot of sort of site moving around of people because yes, of course, you can't have works going on up above with people underneath. So it was really a case of just working very closely with the market to kind of go to close off certain areas, move everybody, decamp everybody over to another area, and then allow those works to go on. And then as areas were finished and completed, then things were, spaces were then sort of opened back up again. So it was a bit of a logistic nightmare in terms of doing that, but working well with the construction team and the market team there, it was, it was a good result.
Terrific, thank you. Now, question for Dan about the Fitzroy Town Hall ceiling works. I had a very simple question. Why just the ceilings? I mean, you've got 21 ceilings. Why?
Yes, well,
interesting.
Yeah. It's always an interesting question. So largely the issue was that the ceilings were in such poor condition that they were making the rooms unusable. The trusses had literally fallen out of the wall in the main hall, such that we had to close the main hall from the public, and it was no longer a viable space for the City of Yarra to use. This was about getting those emergency and urgent works really addressed very quickly so that Fitzroy Town Hall could be publicly accessible again. And at the end of the day, it all comes back down to budget and managing a client's budget. There's not always an endless stream of money to throw at heritage buildings. And so sometimes you've really got to just do what you can do in order to ensure that that fabric is stabilised with the money you have.
So are you going to get the walls now?
I would love to get the walls. If you're prepared to throw some money at it, I'm sure City of Yarra would love to, but it's not the highest thing on their priority at the moment.
Right, thanks. Now, look, a question for Stephanie and Julian. Am I right in thinking that the copper ceiling that you described was in the drill hall, but that was actually entirely removed? I couldn't, possibly you were speaking a little too quickly for me, but is that what happened? So that the copper ceiling has gone?
No, it's absolutely still there. So the coffered ceiling in the orderly room was retained and restored. But what we did was, in terms of the three-storey contemporary building, which is directly adjacent, the ceilings that we spoke about, they're new ceilings that I guess are referencing that in the new contemporary structure.
Right, okay. And beg your pardon, I thought I'd heard copper, but you said coffer.
Yeah.
So, right, now I've got it. Thanks.
Copper would be great though.
Yeah.
So we've got some questions from our virtual audience. Ted Bailey's asked about the student precinct, about what was the view of the Asia Centre building, that's the Sydney Myer Asia Centre, and the connection to the student precinct?
Yeah, we talked about that quite a lot, but we talked about every building that surrounded the precinct in a lot of detail. Building 757, the engineering precinct, they all came into it. But we actually feel what's happened with the Asia Centre is, I mean, it's a great example of its building of its time as well. But actually disconnecting it from the Alice Hoy, which it's dutifully connected to at the time, got rid of the L-shaped blocker at the corner of the entry to Monash Road. So suddenly now you can experience the Asia Centre in the round, which is a positive thing, we think. And it makes it a much more porous entry into the precinct. So I think it's another great building that's just in the backdrop and the surrounds of the campus. And hopefully its urban conditions been improved if you walk around that building now.
Sure. Now, Hannah Louie has a question. She's got a question about the broader awards category and how adaptive reuse is now a part of the Heritage Award, and whether in future adaptive reuse becomes so mainstream that it isn't defined by a separate category. Now, anyone can contribute here. Is there a response?
Philip, just
Pamela?
Oh, Pamela.
Yeah, I can see you champing at the bit here.
Sorry. Christine or Pamela?
My apologies. Sorry, my microphone was off. But I see Christine can talk about this, but this was a big topic and debate.
It caused a lot of angst because it did make the decision making extraordinarily difficult. And I do think that the National AIA need to rethink the heritage category. If we were to have the two subcategories, I think there needs to be two named awards because they're certainly dealing with very different kinds of challenges. And as Hannah said, maybe that will just sort of disappear, the creative, adaptive theme as we are moving to a period. And I think Marika's point about sustainability and the overlaps with heritage and retaining lots of buildings as we move forward is a really good point as well. Did you want to add anything to that, Mark or Pamela?
I just wondered whether or not someone had fed Hannah that question. Because it is one
myself.
It's absolutely one that was central to our conversations, and I think we probably all got quite worked up about it because enough so that we wanted to recommend that they do that ultimately the Institute does separate those categories. And I think it's probably a broader issue within our profession, our discipline, and I think especially in our education, we probably don't get much training, except maybe from the likes of Nigel and Marika, especially around how you deal with existing conditions and how you interact with buildings and cities in sensitive and meaningful ways, I think. And so I think probably not only will it affect the way we judge buildings through awards processes, but really it should go deeply into how we judge practice generally, and look for opportunities to adapt buildings in new and inventive ways.
Yeah, look, I think Mark, you're absolutely right. At the MSD here, we have a number of studios that deal directly with adaptive reuse, but it's not often framed with using those words, but using existing buildings as parameters for students to actually understand those buildings as well as make their special adaptations and alterations. I'm aware there's another question.
Look, am I able to ask a question that's probably clipped from your chat that's just from up the top of it?
Yes, go ahead.
So it's from Jeff Robinson, and it's probably more of a broad one for everybody. It's while undertaking these award-winning heritage refurbishment works, what considerations were made to improving the sustainability and the resilience of the buildings to the future climate which the buildings will continue to operate within?
Can we direct that first one to Dan to get an answer about the ceilings? Because all this fantastic work that Conservation Studio did at Fitzroy, and then you just hate to think that they would get damaged.
Yes, so one of the things we did do is address the rainwater and increased intensity of rainwater events for that building. It has a complex roof structure, and we had our siphonic system designed for 20% extra, such that it should well and truly go into the future without any major issues with the increased heavy rain events moving forward. So it's a key concern for us. You might have noticed in those photos too, there's a lot of insulating board panels that were put in under the slate roof that were done as part of works earlier that I did several years ago to increase the thermal efficiency of that building. So just because heritage buildings are historic buildings, there are always ways in which you can find a way to adapt them or use new technology or new materials in order to try and better their performance. And I think that's a very critical thing to think about.
And others want to add to that conversation?
It might not be exactly answering, but just to say that in both the ex-Frank Tate or the 1939 building and the 1888 building, we went to great lengths to reinstate the natural ventilation in those buildings and not add new mechanical plant, and argue that they could be, that was their original intention. So it was a kind of heritage angle on building services. And it meant that, for example, Frank Tate, the university agreed to that the central market hall was not going to be an examination space because it wouldn't be able to be guaranteed to meet the thermal parameters for those kind of spaces. It was more a casual, semi-open air space. Sure.
And in fact, the university is trying to get rid of most examinations, I think, so it doesn't have to address any mechanical servicing of its buildings. There's a question from Michael Gunn, a question for James. You mentioned a heritage building on Swanson Street that was removed, I've assumed, to facilitate more open and clear pedestrian access. Was there any attempt to look at partial retention or repurposing of the materials from that building?
So firstly, I'm going to give this to Nathan, because Nathan actually did a whole scheme to retain that building right throughout contract.
Yeah, we actually designed a scheme to retain the building, but it hadn't had a program to it at the time we did it. So it was this kind of vague folly. And then there were attempts to find a program. There was an idea to make a center for an entrepreneurial incubator space, more kind of outreach space and support. And we designed an entire other building right there. And in the end, the university, I think, wanted to retain it as an open space and connection to the street. And yeah, we did look at using materials from all over the site, if you remember, James, as aggregate in the concrete. And I can't remember where exactly we did it, but it was looked at a number of places.
Yeah, to be honest, that was done as part of another architect's brief to remove that building and do the clearing. So I don't actually know the answer to that. I do know there was a whole conversation about where the bricks would go, but I don't know.
I can't remember where they ended up.
I will support the university at this moment and say that there's a lot of retention of materials, and especially right now, even furniture, everything is being kept and records made so that they can be reused, which in principle feels like it's a really great move.
Yeah, we reused furniture in the library. What's the name of that library in the student pavilion? The Rowden White, which was all taken from the original Rowden White library and intermingled it.
Well, now we've come to the end of our time. We're only 3 minutes over time, so I'm really pleased.
Well done.
I'd like to thank all of our panellists. I'm not going to name everyone, but look, thanks so much for spending time with us today. I'm going to do a promo for 2 further events. On Wednesday, the 4th of October, we have the Miles Lewis oration at 6 o'clock here in the MSD, where Rosemary Hill from the UK is talking to us about meaning and memory through the long history of Stonehenge. She goes really from Neolithic times to when in the 1960s there were new druids operating at Stonehenge. So that will be a terrific evening, the Miles Lewis oration. And then there's the ACAHUCH Symposium on Friday, November the 3rd, called Prefab and Pre-Cut, Affordable Housing in Post-War Australia, 1945 to 1975, where we've got speakers coming from interstate and from within the faculty and the profession, talking about prefabricated houses, and where we're looking only at government solutions, government stepping in to solve a so-called housing crisis. That's November the 3rd. So I'd like, on behalf of all of my ACAHUCH team and ACAHUCH directors, and also on behalf of Theo too, who I'd like to thank as well, I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance today, but most particularly to all of our award-winning panellists. Thanks so much for contributing to today's presentation, but also to the heritage of Victoria's architecture. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Well chaired.
Thank you. And
Great event.
we'll do another one next year with the award winners. So it's always a good event. And if you want to give us any feedback about how to do it, we find the online mode is quite good. But we're happy to be dissuaded. Last year we did it with everyone sitting here in the Japanese room facing the screen. But I think the online process is more immediate and quite good. Yeah. Right. So congratulations again, everyone, on your awards too. And thanks so much to the jury members, Mark, Christine and Pamela.